Welcome back, artists. I'm Waiya Paints, and in the grim dark future, there is only war. And what better way to honor our righteous brethren than to commission a statue? And this week, we have Opium Clay Studios returning as a sponsor with this mountain of a model. And I don't say that lightly. This thing clocked in at over 1.5 kilograms at final shelf weight. And all that resin gets you tons of detail. And every single one of them is going to flex our artistic muscles. And it's the reason for this supersized episode. Thankfully, using all the skills I've highlighted in my videos, we should be able to handle this section by section until it's done. And in just a few hours, even you could have an amazing statue to put on your shelf. Now, I've got Lieutenant Titus all primed and ready. So, meet me over by the painting table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Now, when I said this was big, I wasn't kidding. It starts with this serving platter plinth. Oh, and all of this too, but that can wait. For now, our first steps start with the base. Zooming in, we have what looks like some type of metal bottom with a front insignia and a cracked stone top. Since I know I'm going to be doing the stone in a neutral gray, I want to plan ahead and get a contrasting color for the metallic. A deep patinaed bronze will look good, paired with a silver plaque and a gold filigree, and I think we'll have a winner. Paint number 1, rough iron. If you've seen the lopo I did last week, this will look familiar. If this is your first time, you want a heavy dry brush to lay down a 90% coverage base coat, leaving the black primer to peek out in the deeper creases. 40K is famous for the grim dark storyline and art style, which tends to call for inky black shadows wherever you can. While the true grim dark style requires many oil wash applications, I want to try to simulate the vibe of it without the extra work. Maybe one of these days I'll go the full 9 yards and show off the style, but for today, I think dipping our toes in and having a mindset is a good intro. We're good to go for our highlight of hammered copper. Here I switched up to a light dry brush. This way I can restrict the paint to just the sharper details while laying down a faint scratchy highlight. This is why I maintain a single stroke direction all the way around the base. This will build a natural looking grain to the metal for no extra added effort. And that really is the secret to becoming a better painter. You find these little tricks to pull off common objects and surfaces quickly so you can spend more time on the harder, more time-consuming parts. Next, I need to handle the plaque, and for what I want to do, I'm going to need some masking to protect my earlier work. Mask can be an invaluable tool when painting messy will give better results than painting clean. Thankfully here, I have a nice clean straight edge to follow, so this should be pretty painless. Just be sure to use a painter's delicate masking tape if you can. Standard tape can be a bit too sticky and rip up your paint, or even leave a sticky residue. I suggest you spend the extra couple of bucks and get some quality tape on hand. A roll like this lasts a lot longer than you think. After isolating the plaque, black metal will form my base. Similar to the rough iron, I'm looking to get 90% coverage with the black surviving in the creases. Although there was this one weird area that for some reason was just being weird. I don't know why, but at this angle I got this black area that just would not fill in right. At the end of the day, I think it was just some quirk of the angle that the metallics were sitting at, but to solve it, I went with an all-over stipple for an anodized aluminum look. For a bit of grain detail, light gunmetal. Just like the highlight to the iron, I kept my strokes going in one direction to build a consistent grain to the metal. My focus here is to get a solid but hairline thin highlight along the top edge of the plaque. Finally, a bit of greedy gold for the filigree. Just be sure to thin this down and almost treat this as a wash, which is where our friend airbrush medium comes in. I want to get the gold semi-transparent to let it just tint up the established silvers. This lets me use the built-up midtone and highlights without having to repaint them. Just a couple of super thin coats and it will look like we intended to paint it like this in the first place. Working smarter, not harder. Now for a really satisfying mask pull. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff. That's enough feel goods. Time to rock and roll with Dungeon Gray. First, to carefully edge out the rim, being sure to not muck up my work. Then swapping out to a fun silly brush to mop some color across the top. Remember, there's going to be a large pile of rubble in the center, so getting full coverage there won't be needed. The easy rule of thumb here is if the sculptor didn't see need to add details here, there's no reason to paint it. My pile of shame is too large for me to paint things I won't even see. Now, this stone needed a bit of character, so an all-over wash with Nuln Oil helped bring out the personality of the stone. And by personality, I mean how old and broken it is. It's kind of hard to overdo this step, as long as you do it evenly, but if it is a bit uneven, you can always tone it down with a medium dry brush of Dungeon Gray. Just don't forget to wash the rim, or you might end up with an inverted tub ring around your base. And just to add a bit more fidelity to the stone, a very soft dry brush of light, bright, almost white gray. It won't be much, but just a light kiss to all the nooks and crannies. With the plinth done, it was time to worry about this rubble. At first I thought this was a mix of stone and dirt, but the telltale signs of exposed rebar clued me in that this was going to be some demolished concrete of some type, with a few added details of I-beams and a crushed Tyranid. I'll get to those. For now, I need this gray matter handled, so I took a similar path as before, starting with basing in Dungeon Gray. And since there's no need to paint clean here, messy fast fun is the name of the game. Just do your due diligence to keep it thin and even. Just because it's rubble doesn't mean we don't want it to look good. As before with the base, it's time to shade with a bit of Nuln Oil. This time, I want to show you a little trick that makes shading a bit easier. I'm shading this upside down. This way, as the wash settles into the recesses to dry, these surfaces will be up and underneath the lips and overhangs once it's turned right side up. This doesn't mean we can overload this rock though. Keep control over the shade and restrict it to this underside surface with a bit creeping up on the sides. Because overshading here can lead to disaster, be sure to watch for any dripping. Once the wash dried, Spaceship Exterior coupled with my floofiest brush came into play to lay down the edge highlight on all of the rubble. Just be sure to keep your strokes going from the top down to maintain the lighting angle. This is again another one of those spots where it can be very easy to overdo this. So do yourself a favor and double check your brush each time you reload. You want to ease up the highlight until you can start to see it and then move on. The concrete is looking great. Let's take care of that metalwork. Just like the plinth, all of the rebar and I-beams got an all-over basing of rough iron. The one difference here is that I want 100% coverage. I'm going to be weathering these a lot, so starting with a fully saturated metallic is good. Now for a bit of glorious gold. I'm using this as a highlight pass to help contrast this metal from the metal in the plinth. At the end of the day, this is more of a me thing, as after all the weathering, you won't be really able to tell what color it used to be. And the first step of that weathering is to build up some gunk with sterling mud. If you've never used it, this is a texture paint that has tiny silica beads mixed in, so that when it dries, it has a gritty texture. It's great for when a model is supposed to be dirt, but it was rendered smooth. A bit of this will add some random gritty surface texture that you would expect. Here, I'm looking to harness the texture side mostly. I want this to give me a nice crusty surface to replicate that corrosive layer. But as you can see, the silica can work its way into the hairs of your brush and wreak havoc. So I strongly recommend not using your nicer brushes for it. Using cheapos and brushes that are already on their way out can save you a bit of grief. Next, a bit of Riser Rust. This stuff is hella dry and chunky, and that's kind of the point. Here, I'm speckling this on top of the dried sterling texture. I know there really isn't any transition here, but that's gonna come later. Right now, think of this as pre-highlighting where the most interesting bits of rust are. Just don't overdo it or it'll start looking artificial. Finally, it's Dirty Down Rust time. Now this stuff is a powerful tool to use, but you gotta remember, you can't really control how it acts. You can only tell it where to play. As it dries, it'll seemingly gain randomly brighter rust patterns. And if you don't like it, you can re-wet it and rework it. Some people say adding water and reworking it will get you brighter spots, but it's been kinda hit or miss for me. So when I do use this product, it's because I've already embraced the randomness of it as a positive. Just FYI, like texture paint, Dirty Down Rust can gunk up your brush, so don't use your favorite pricey brush for this. Pick a scraggle brush like mine. And lastly, shake the bottle well. It was a good 3 minutes of shaking before the bearing inside even started making any noise. So, shake baby shake. Now to quickly handle the skulls with a touch of skeletal bone. Here, a chunky dry brush is going to lay down some nice grim dark shadow texture for me without much fuss. The key here is to not let the paint eat up all of the shadows. You can get a bit of a safety net for this if you treat it kind of like priming with a rattle can. You want sweeping strokes that begin and end off the model. This way, you make sure that you get more of the side of the bristles rather than the tip. Switching my attention to the dead Tyranid, I'm using a pretty common color scheme of a light pink skin, dark purple armor, and dark red claws. But here, I'm not actually painting him pink. Instead, I'm using Spaceship Exterior, which is a very, very light gray. Now, putting this over black is going to take many coats if you're thinning your paints properly. So, settle in and get comfy. It's going to take those layers because we got a lot of fine details here. Slapping on thick coats of paint will fill up the finer surface details really fast. Now to add a pink hue with some magenta shade and contrast medium. Mixing in a bit of contrast medium increases the transparency of the shade, but also gives the color a bit more bite to hang onto the flat surfaces and not just be pulled into the cracks. While I usually avoid pooling during washes, here I'm making an exception. With the contrast medium, the wash won't coffee stain as bad. And due to the position of the body, you really only need to focus on the top side. From this point on, while I will repeat any steps on the bottom side, I won't be spending as much time trying to get it perfect. These areas will be well hinted and at most only need the suggestion of color. After some dry time, I switched to my small floofy brush for a restricted dry brush of Spaceship to clean up the shade and slowly fade out the pink from the peaks to just a slight blush. And as mentioned, the underside was addressed, but very much neglected. Like that one child you love as much as your other children, but if one had to go, Moving over to the claws with Chaotic Red. Since I want to get some moody shadows here, I'm not really driving this paint into the details. This is so I get to preserve that primer black in the eroded holes and cracks. I just think the bright pink, almost white on the skin with the dark inky black shadows really leans into making this feel very alien. And to give those shadows a bit of a hand, a touch of oil stains. Now, strictly speaking, this stuff isn't actually black. It's Army Painter's version of streaky grime. It's a very sooty, deep brown gray. But over a dark red, it might as well be black. I've been testing out more and more of the Fanatic line, and so far I'm pretty impressed. I just wish I could find a better deal on it. It's a great product, but it comes at a price. After getting each crack and damaged area a dose, I put some extra towards the tip of the claw. Now, Dragon Red is going to be just perfect for the highlight. It's our old friend dry brushing again, this time keeping it pretty light. This is more for brush control. Going a bit too fast or strong can lead to overspill onto the skin, which at this point would be a giant pain to repaint. So even though it's dry brushing, it's a serious painting section. A slow but useful tip is to try dry brushing a single detail at a time. It's not always a useful skill to have, but when it's needed, it's a skill that saves the day. A day of repaints, that is. To base the Chithan armor, Violet. Now, I'm not a 40k player. In fact, this is only my second 40k model ever painting. So, color me surprised when I find out one of the most common paint schemes for these aliens is bright pink and purple. It's just they're not exactly the colors that come to mind when I'm told that this is the grim dark future where there is only war. And just like with the red, a bit of oil streak is going to shade the damaged areas. After this dried, I gave it a light dry brush of alien purple, but that clip got lost to the ether. My bad. Next is Carapace in Chaotic, followed by Highlight in Dragon Red. Then, to base the teeth, Dirty Bone. The teeth was kind of a crapshoot for me. Looking at reference photos, it seems like Tyranid teeth can just be whatever. So I went boring and just grabbed bone. I know, super lame, but I wanted to use it as an opportunity to show you a new technique. And having a nice bright base will make it easier to show. Now, to shade the teeth, we're going to be using the two brush method, so called because it uses two brushes. You're also going to need some shade, in this case light tone, and some clean water, and of course two brushes. Now, you can hold them in one hand if you treat them sort of like chopsticks. It's not necessary for this method, but it will make the technique far less tedious and time consuming. Heck, you can even do it with one brush if you wanted to, but again, it would just take a lot more time. So the idea here is that you have one brush with your wash or paint, and then one brush that you just dampen with clean water. And then from there, it's only two steps. Step 1, lay down some wash where you want the strongest shade. Then switch to your clean brush to blend out the edge by starting at the edge of the wash and brushing away from the shading. This way, your brush picks up a touch of color that gets thin with the water and spread out across the rest of the tooth. Then, because of flow dynamics, you'll get a nice feathered blend from the shaded areas. The key takeaway on this is to work quickly. You have to blend with a clean brush before the wash starts to dry. Otherwise, you'll get a coffee stain line in the middle of your blend. This is the reason for using 2 brushes in one hand. It cuts down that time. Take it tooth by tooth until you get a flow, and before you know it, you'll have a new skill under your belt. With the base finally done, it's a great time to take a few moments to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Through thick and thin, you all-stars find the generosity to dig deep and find a few bucks to throw Waiya's way, and I can't thank you enough. Last week, thanks to your generosity, I was able to purchase a whole bunch of discount paint for the paint wall, and it's gifts like that that keep this dream train rolling on down the tracks. If you would like to join the painting pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. Or you can support the channel right here on YouTube for free by subscribing, liking, and maybe even leaving a comment. Gotta love that engagement. And before we get back to work, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Opium Clay Studios for being our sponsor this week. This is a beast of a model that's just dripping with detail. If you want to get your hands on this model and see what else there may be brewing up, be sure to use the link in my description and head on over to their Patreon. Heck, you might even find your next project. For now, there's a galaxy full of aliens that need purging. Let's start painting the bell of the ball, starting with the power armor and deep blue. Now, I know it looks a bit light on the bottle, but over black, this will darken a touch. Just ensure you have an opaque coverage over all of the armor. So that means at least 2 coats. Here, I'm using a floofy brush like a mop, and I was able to lay down 2 very fast coats. The longer and loose bristles get into the details fairly well if you use a bit of a stabbing swipe motion. Just be on the lookout for any paint buildup in the panel lines and along the trim. There's a lot of sharp detail here that we want to keep sharp. So if you see any buildup, give it a quick swipe to clean it up before it becomes a problem. The first highlight, fittingly enough, ultramarine blue. Fun fact, ultramarines are named after the color and not the other way around. Now for this tone, I want it to be a general highlight of the metal, so I'm using a stipple to apply it. This will give me a soft, glowy, ethereal highlight to it. Just focus this toward the center of each armor section, almost like each piece has its own special spotlight. But when it comes to the legs, I treated the thigh and lower legs as single sections despite the separate plates that make them up. This is mainly to get correct volumetric highlights. It's a very fancy term for saying I'm treating it like a simpler shape for highlighting. Sometimes education is making something very simple sound overly clever. So the simple way to do this is to use an overhead light and hold the model at a single angle while you trace out the light's reflection. On the video here, it looks like I'm a little bit off, but that's just due to the camera being at a different angle than my eyes. If you're gonna do this, make sure to maintain the consistent angle of deflection from your light source. So that means you don't want to change the distances between the part, your eyes, or the light. Any one of these moving will change the placement of the reflection. After some practice, you should be able to take a mental snapshot of where the reflections are, so you won't have to hold such rigid posture. As a final armor highlight, troglodyte blue. This will be the edge highlight, so we're switching it to a very light dry brush, and I don't want to disturb the highlight of the ultramarine, so I want this to be super targeted to the edges of the panels. When done correctly, The final look will be a bright, crisp edge highlight that dips down to the deep blue, only to soften up to the vibrant ultramarine volumetric highlight. It's really cool when you nail it, but you gotta exercise an extreme level of brush control. Just slightly too much paint on your brush can muck up all of your work. No need to rush. Check your paint load, then double check it with a test swipe. Your patience will be rewarded. Time to go to Browntown with Monster Brown. Just a simple basing for the pouches, belt, and his crotch cloth. Keep it smooth and fully opaque and you should be good. Like most leather I paint, this needs a light tone shade. Here, I diluted the tone down a bit. I find thinning it down makes it behave more consistently when it comes to coverage. Even with spectacular shaking habits, pigments can be oddly clumpy, but a touch of water will eliminate it. Just don't overdo it or you'll end up with a glaze. Extra care should go into getting the stitching evenly shaded. This way, the highlights later will really make them pop. For that highlight, I'm using Desert Yellow. You want a medium light dry brush here to catch the softer surface contours. Because it's mostly flat, you might be tempted to leave on a bit more pigment on your brush to get an easier time, but this will give you too much coverage. Remember that dry brushing has two major elements that control its coverage: pigment load and brush pressure. So instead, keep the pigment load light and apply a bit more pressure through your brush. That way, even the softer details like the waves in the leather can pick up this color. This will take a bit of practice like anything else, but stick with it and you'll get the hang of it in no time. Once it was dry, the browns were looking silky, but then I checked some reference photos and I realized this brown cloth will have to go. But before I repainted, I handled the belt buckle with a trio of blues. Due to needing to dry brush the final color, I want to take care of this now before I paint the light gray, so I don't have to stress about any overspill. It only took a few minutes to get the belt looking homogeneous with the rest of the armor. And can't forget about his booty armor, gotta protect that dump truck. Now to repaint the cloth, starting with ash gray. While it's kind of a burn to paint over such nice looking leather, I don't want to incur the wrath of the 40k crowd. The Warhammer stands are no joke, so to correct my mistake, I'm starting with this medium light gray. Whenever you want to paint something white, it's almost always better to not paint it white. So in this case, I'm going with a very light but ever so slightly gray. So light in fact that this ash gray is going to serve as the shadow. So a fully opaque coat is a must. Gotta hide my shame and that brown. Once dry, I came in with a magic touch of spaceship exterior for the subtle step towards pure white. When picking your stroke angle here, it's best to utilize the folds of the cloth to create as many dynamic shadows that fit with an overhead light as you can. And I like keeping my cloth transitions super soft to help sell the contrasting material sitting right next to the metal armor. And since I've got the grays out, I went ahead and based all the under armor ribbing. No super secrets here, just paint clean around the armor and you should be good. If you can maintain the black seams, then great. If not, don't kick yourself if it floods. And besides, I'm planning on a messy wash here later, so no worries either way. And just like I mentioned, it's wash time with Nuln Oil. Don't overthink it. Slap it on, wick up the excess, and move on. This kind of area would collect all kinds of dirt, oil, and grime. So this area should be a bit scuzzy. Next, I masked off some parts for a bit of metallic dry brushing, starting with a base of black metal to knock down all the blue, followed by the feathery touch of dry brush mithril. To add a bit more interest, I focused this towards 1/4 of the opening and made a cool gradation from the side. Easy peasy. Now we just gotta wait for it to dry so we can do it all again on the other side. Just make sure to pick the same quarter to highlight the exhaust. That way the sides match and they marry each other. Keep the metallics out, I based the main ports and fins with black metal as well, which of course was followed by a mithril dry brush highlight. Just don't forget to do some edge highlighting on the fins. It only takes a couple of swipes to get a really cool weathered look, like the edges have built up some dust and soot. Moving over to his gun, I've already masked off the hand to protect my blues. And as you may have guessed, dry brushing will be involved here as well. Looking at reference pictures, it seems like bolter guns are generally a collection of gray metals, so I want to introduce a bit of variation with the different parts by first basing a few in black metal. While this is still very dark, it's a world different compared to just the primer black. Then it was time to give everything an edge highlight with mithril and a wispy dry brush. Remember, it really does not take much pigment on your brush to show up on black, so keep it in mind. Once you get your paint load dialed in, you want to attack this dry brush from every angle you see to give every edge a misting highlight. Then a bit of thinned down greedy gold took care of the double eagle. Just like with the black, the gold is thinned down and brushed on over the silver. Honestly, this part feels like straight up cheating how easy it is to get awesome results. Never underestimate the power of thin and smooth. Now to switch gears with this little emblem here, as we embark on our journey into true metallic metals. You may have seen me lay down tons of different metals super fast with dry brushing, but what happens when you can't? Like here, I could maybe pull it off, but I'd be very restricted on what angles I could work with. So knowing multiple ways of getting good results only makes us better painters. So without further ado, we're going to practice our true metal metallics today. And it starts with a good base, and in this case I'm using death metal, which is just one of the coolest names for a paint ever. Don't forget to thin your metallics though. We want to know paint coat, and we want it smooth. Now to make some magic happen with greedy gold. But the thing is, I'm not trying to blend it at all, and I want to leave sharp transitions. And specifically, I'm only painting half of each leaf that is the most exposed. Not only for the ease of painting, but it's a safe bet that these surfaces would be the most reflective to our eye. For the skull, I kind of paint it like I'm painting with a non-metallic, but just by highlighting shine on areas that would catch light, like the cheekbone, brows, chin, and forehead. Finally, I finish off with a newcomer, bright gold. Here, I want to follow a different light source from the previous layer. So on the one before, the highlights would have been hitting from right above. Now, I want to slant this angle in my head to be coming from the right side, going to the left. So I caught the top edges of the right side leaves and the outside edge of the left side leaves. At least to my eye, this stacking of light sources results in a pretty good simulated true metallic metal. Now, this is a very stripped down idea of the technique, but using this as a starting point isn't a bad idea. And as luck would have it, we've got plenty of times to exercise on this model, like on the jetpack. Here, while we do have just a larger skull, the leaves have been swatched out for a lucky galactic horseshoe, inside of which has a very interesting hammered texture. And this difference means I'm going to have to handle it differently when it comes to the highlights. While the skull stayed roughly the same, the horseshoe needed a bit of experimentation. First, I tried having highlight rays across the face. I did like it, but I ended up thinking I wanted to save that for the last highlight. So the trim got an all over hitting, while the inner texture got a scruffy dry brushing. This will give it the look like it's been wiped down with rags often, but never really cleaned. Now for the final highlight of bright gold, and I really dig how it ended up. A second competing reflecting pattern here probably would have made this a bit too busy. So say it with me everyone, less is more. Now with the extra practice under my belt, it's time to tackle the main eye draw of the entire model. And even I appreciate the bit of extra practice before I paint such a focal point, if only to reinforce my confidence that I can pull off what I want to pull off. Sometimes just walking through the steps reminds you, yeah, you know how to dance. Though extra care should be made around the lettering. Metallics are notoriously chunky, so shake the devil out of your paints and thin them well. But while doing the skull, I felt the wings were a touch too bright for the battlefield, so I knocked them down a step or two using a thin coat of light tone, just a all-over wash to dull everything slightly. Since I had the gold out, I might as well dab a bit of bright gold on each of the exposed rivets around the armor. Next, I slid over to the trim on the pauldrons, again stepping through the golds, but this time feeling confident enough to switch to a dry brush for the highlights. I did try to make the shading interesting by focusing the highlights on the corners and the peaks of the rounded edges for a bit of dynamic lighting. Now for a bit more high-stress detail painting with ash gray. Getting clean lines here is going to be paramount. And as a tip for crisp lines, paint with the tip almost laying down on the surface using sweeping strokes as you tiptoe up to the edge that you want. And you're going to need a fully opaque coverage here, so be prepared to do multiple coats over the blue. Now, you might also notice one of the print errors I had. It resulted in these ring-shaped layer shifts that happened on both the pauldrons. Due to having to print these solids, reprinting wasn't the greatest option, and sanding them would ruin the sculpted surface texture. So I made the plan on camouflaging it by ignoring some of it and treating the more prominent areas as battle damage. With a bit of creative thinking, you can take these printing missteps and turn them into wins. Only limit here is your creativity and the courage to try. With the shoulder out of the way, time to do it again, this time with the knee and inverted as to reserve the cool highlighted blue horseshoe. And I am 100% sure there's somebody pulling out their hair every time I call it a horseshoe. Sorry fellas, I don't know what it's called. I just sling the paint. Be sure to let me know what it's called in the comments. Engagement, baby. After about 3-ish coats, I found the coverage I needed to move on. And I'm moving on to more ash gray. This time on the scroll for the opposite pauldron. Again, like the other gray sections, lock in, and paint clean within the lines. And when it comes to the engraved lettering, limiting how much paint you have on your brush will help prevent it from flooding it. While I still had the gray out, I took care of the armor suspenders. After this, the armor is technically done, but I want to give you the starting steps to go bigger. So let's do some battle damage. Starting with matte black, we got to put our brave caps on, as we need to fill in all of the major cracks and splits on the armor. Any gouges, bullet holes, deep dents need to be blacked out. Once you feel comfortable with your brush control, get into more of the finer scratches you can see on the armor. Remember, you can stop at any time, but the more you add, the thinner and finer you want the scratches to be. Use the sculpt as a guide. The more noticeable the scratch is, the more intense the black should be. But don't feel the need to do every scratch. You see, what we're painting here is all the areas where the damage broke through the top layers of the paint and down to the primer. So you want scratchy edges, no smooth round edges unless it's a bullet hole. The finer scratches you can make, the more realistic your model will look overall. And once I got to the Pauldrons, it was a good opportunity to hide some of the layer shift as battle damage. You just gotta paint boldly and with confidence over your old work. A scared painter has a shaky brush, so YOLO. Also, this is a good time to black out all the small detail vents around the armor. Once all the black dries, you can leave it there as worn armor, but I want to take this another step further by breaking out the mithril and highlighting all of the scratches we made. Holes and dents will need to get filled in, leaving a nice ring of black. We're trying to simulate the damage digging down past the primer into the raw metal. So in larger holes, don't just fill the hole in blindly, but give it a patchy random fill to make it look more natural. For the scratches, the goal is to put a thinner scratch within the borders of the black one. This may not be possible for all scratches, so you may want to skip the very faint ones. But it's good practice to try. So long as you have at least one side of the scratch still lined with black, it should look okay. Expect this to take just as long, if not longer, than laying down the first step, as you may find yourself debating whether or not to attempt to scratch.
Rage on that beat, going crazy.
Time to get some FaceTime with Titus, and this is a man that has seen over 200 years of hard combat, and it shows on his face. So I went with mixes of bad bruise and tan flesh. Using the old trusty wet palette, I mixed up a 50-50 base and started slinging. As you can see, the thinned down flesh tone on black will need many coats to get opaque, and this is what we want. This gives us a ton of control as we build up the layers of color where we want the most vibrancy. Next, with a heavy mix of tan flesh, I'm starting to restrict where I add color, focusing on about 40% of the face. Ultimately, I'm trying to recreate that soot-covered trench face from old World War II photos, so extra care needs to be made to retain the depth of the shadows. So watch your paint load and keep your touch light. Be patient, and you can start to build up a nice somber glow. Finally, with mostly tan flesh, I highlighted his scar and gave final speckle highlights to the cheeks and his ears. Holding the head to paint from above will help you visualize what areas could use this final pass of detail. His hair got a quick base of dirt spatter, followed by a rough dry brush of monster brown. The only product in his hair is chainsword grease. Now back to the metallics with the chain wrapped around his arm, using black metal for the loops and death metal for the clap fasteners in the middle. Then a highlight using mithril to edge the loops and bright gold for the clasp. With the chain done, it's time to go back to the pauldron and base the sunburst in chaotic red. Just do your best to get crisp lines along the blue armor border. Next, switch to dragon red and stipple on a highlight focused towards the skull. It'll take a bit of doing to get this visible, so expect to have to go over this a few times before you're ready to move on. With the red down, time for the skull with a simple base of dirty bone. Just do your best to keep the eye holes and nose clean and dark. This is followed by light tone to add a bit of depth to the details. Like with the teeth, a two-brush method comes in handy to blend out the shade for a natural look. See, I told you the skill would be useful. It's just unfortunate from this angle the lighting shows off my print error. Don't shame me! Next up, these reliquary bones. A quick dry brush of gunmetal for the clasp. Then a basing of the box in chaotic red. The bones got a coat of dirty bone, followed by a light shading. And finally, a touch of gunmetal for the fastener. And done. Let's move on to the chainsword, starting with chaotic red for the grip. Then a bit of black metal for singling out panels. And just because I love the color, a bit of death metal for this part on the hilt. Time for the edge highlighting dry brush path using mithril, while also getting a bit of a scrubby scratchy highlight in the recessed panels. Just be careful going over the death metal as it will start to desaturate it. Flipping it back to the hilt, the skull got handled just like the previous skull. Time to get a bit religious and paint a whole bunch of purity seals, starting with basing the paper in dirty bone. Reusing paint already on a palette saves time, paint, and patience. 2 coats and it was good to go. Now with a bit of black and a detail brush, some random squiggles stand in for scripture. But as a fun detail, I like to leave blank spaces in the scroll. This is to add an accent color to punch it up a bit. And in this case, I'm going with Dragon Red. The touches of red here and there give the impression of sections written in blood, and I can totally see this in a range of colors depending on the situation, like green to convey a poisonous aspect. And don't be afraid to get creative with adding little sketch shapes here and there, like the occasional red oval towards the bottom to symbolize a thumbprint in blood. Just don't overdo it with the accent color. It should be no more than 10% of your total squiggles. Then the wax seals got a base of chaotic red and a soft highlight of dragon red to finish them off. As a final step, I filled in the whites of his eyes with a touch of light gray. This model has those concave sculpted eyes, which is kind of a double-edged sword. While on one hand it makes it a lot easier for new painters to get consistent sized eyes, it comes with a cost of limiting the eyes to one position and size. And I haven't really come up with an easy or skillful way of handling them, but thankfully at this scale I can kind of get away with leaving them just black. Then each of his service studs got a dab of gold to recognize the lieutenant's long career in service of the Emperor of Man, which is where I called this done. This looks amazing. The blues, whites, and creams are nice and poppy. The true metallics look insane. Even the alien and the skulls do a great job to break up all the gray from the rubble on the base. And the worn-in painting style really makes this feel just like another day of the war. One cool detail I like is that 90% of the sculpted damage is on the front side of his armor, really letting you know these guys don't run from a fight. Hats off to Opium Clay for such an amazing sculpt, and thank you for being this week's sponsor. Again, if you want to get a crack at this model, be sure to check out the link to their Patreon below. You might just find your next project. Also, special shout out to Sarah and Lily. I hope you liked the episode. I know it took a little bit longer to get this one out, but as you can see, it also took quite a bit more work to get it done. Hopefully the extra weight was worth it. Now, I've got projects and commissions stacking up for the Christmas rush. That means this is where I leave you. But as always, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.